Welcome into another edition of D1 Extra. I'm D1 Ticker's Brian Fisher. Pleased to be joined by a good friend in Brandon Huffman, national recruiting editor for 247 Sports. And Brandon, we've been doing a lot of national signing days over the years, nearly 2 decades in the business for yourself. What was your reaction to Travis Hunter flipping, not just from Florida State to another school, but flipping to Jackson State?
19 recruiting classes I've covered, and I have never seen anything like it. In fact, our group thread for the recruiting side of things, we were just trying to come up with something that even was in the category. And I thought DeAnthony Thomas from USC to Oregon, Shaq Thompson from Cal to Washington were some of the more monumental ones. But those don't even register as a blip compared to Jackson State landing Travis Hunter, the number one player in the country per the 247 Sports composite rankings, our number one player in this class. I mean, when people thought there was talk he was going to flip, they thought it'd be to Georgia, where he's from. The Bulldogs were the number one team for the majority of the year. We're at the top of the recruiting rankings. I don't think anybody expected Jackson State to get him. And certainly when the rumors first started this morning, there was a lot of, huh? So when it finally happened, I think shock was the best way to describe it.
How much of this was maybe reflective of HBCUs becoming much more of a viable option for kids, and how much of it was just, the Deion factor?
I think it was a combination of the two. I think the fact that Deion is at an HBCU certainly enhances Jackson State's profile. I think when we've seen guys in the past year and a half start to include HBCUs in their top 5 or their top 10, we've seen on the basketball side as well, it's always been kind of a cursory mention. You never really thought the kid was going to go there. And so when you have a guy who was committed to Florida State for 21 months, flipped to Jackson State, we know that a lot of this had to do with Deion. And the irony in all this is that he spurns Deion's alma mater to go play for Deion. Maybe this is a shot across the bow from Deion because he was passed up for the job that he wanted. Maybe he thought that he should have been hired when Mike Norvell was hired. But what a way to get some revenge and to land probably, without question, the most impactful FCS signee in the modern recruiting era.
Yeah, I think certainly a historic one. And obviously NIL was a big part of this signing class overall. I think in general, it's the first class to officially have NIL. What has caught your eye on that subject? And how are coaches and programs maybe using NIL effectively in recruiting?
Yeah, it was fascinating because when June brought back the official visit period, when it was cut off for the first 6 weeks because the dead period didn't end until June, this was the first year you started to hear about NIL presentations being a part of the official visit. And now when you talk to recruits after they would take their visits in the fall, it was no longer about the community. It was no longer about the college town atmosphere. It wasn't about the facilities or what their sports nutrition program looked like. It was NIL. How can going to that school help your brand? How can it help you get some NIL products and some opportunities to make some money? I mean, we saw it affect Quinn Ewers, who left the state of Texas as a junior, going into his senior year, decided to skip his senior season, went to Ohio State with the idea that he was going to make some money from NIL. Now he's back at Texas with more discussion about NIL. So what are we hearing on the day where we're supposed to be talking about NLIs? We're hearing about NIL. And I think that has become the new frontier of what college coaches are going to have to really hit home on when they're hosting official visits, when they're in houses for in-home visits. And NIL, I think, is going to reshape recruiting as we know it for the foreseeable future.
If NIL was the big storyline coming out of July, obviously in August, realignment was the big thing. Obviously, Texas, Oklahoma moved conferences, but we also saw some other schools, Marshall and James Madison, moving up into the Sun Belt. Who maybe benefited the most on the recruiting trail when they're making that pitch to recruits, and maybe who suffered the most?
Well, I think one school that really benefited from it was BYU. In the same year, it's funny because BYU beats Utah for the first time in 11 years. Utah's going to the Rose Bowl. BYU is going to play in Shreveport. So I think BYU now sees, hey, we won 5 games against the Pac-12, but we don't get to go to as big or marketable as a bowl. That'll change when they get into the Big 12. But I think from a recruiting standpoint, you look at the amount of players that they flipped down the stretch, guys that were headed elsewhere that decided to pick BYU, guys that were being recruited by other schools that still picked BYU, didn't commit there. But BYU's class, one of the things that a lot of these late additions said is the idea that they're going to the Big 12 was something that attracted me. I know that I have a chance to go there and potentially play for a national championship. We saw a year ago when BYU was unbeaten for the majority of the season until they played Coastal Carolina and lost. What happens when a BYU team is undefeated? There's not as much buzz. There's a lot of talk that BYU maybe should have been considered for a New Year's Six Bowl. Well, now you go 11-2, you win your conference, you finish in the top 2 in the Big 12. Now those opportunities probably keep you from having to go to Shreveport and give you an equal playing field with your in-state rival that you happen to beat. I think BYU probably benefited the most of any of the schools making that move.
It's interesting you mentioned BYU because Kalani Sitake was kind of mentioned for a few jobs, especially on the West Coast. The coaching carousel was kind of the dominant storyline going into signing day. A lot of administrators kind of griping about whether the date needs to move up, move back. What ultimately have you gotten feedback from in terms of the coaches you talk to, in terms of maybe the parents of players that you talk to, even the players themselves, in terms of making this decision now versus maybe waiting until February?
Yeah, I know there's a lot of buzz that at the AFCA convention next month, there's going to be a proposal basically designed to put into place a different time for the early signing period. Perhaps they'll go with the college basketball model where college basketball has the early signing period in November, then they have the late signing period in April, and it sandwiches the season between those two. So maybe now with official offers going out for a senior class on August 1st, perhaps we'll see in mid-August an early signing period and then the next one to happen in January. Maybe the NCAA transfer portal has its own signing period because with a lot of these coaches, I mean, think about if you're in a conference championship game as a school, you lost that weekend to host official visits if you were playing on Saturday. Now you had 1 weekend to host official visits and try to get your coaches out on the road where the rest of your conference was hosting officials, was getting out on the road. You couldn't do in-home visits around the country because you're preparing for your conference championship game. So now you got all the transfers that go into the transfer portal. You have the own guys on your own roster you're trying to keep from going into the portal. Maybe there's a little bit of a rescheduling to where transfer recruiting happens separately so it doesn't affect high school recruiting. But I think there's going to have to be a way for these coaches to manage their time. Otherwise, we're going to start to see more coaches being fired in midseason. And like what happened with Notre Dame, where Brian Kelly left with the possibility Notre Dame could get into the playoff, we may start seeing coaches leave in the middle of the season because college programs that have fired a coach are so desperate to fill that role for recruiting purposes.
It's interesting you mentioned the one-time transfer portal. This is kind of really the first full cycle we've had where coaches have been able to adjust from it. And it seems like class sizes generally are a little bit smaller than we're used to seeing. Is that because everybody is just holding back those scholarships on top of knowing that they can replace the 7 additional guys through the transfer portal?
No question. And then you take the fact that most of these schools, all of these schools lost the spring evaluation period for April and May. They had June where they could host camps or go to some camps. But then otherwise, they have maybe a week in July they could have camps. They were limited to in-person evaluations. So it's no surprise that you're seeing a large number of players that signed in the 2021 class go into the portal because those commitments were made sight unseen. Guys didn't get a chance to get to know those coaches other than Zoom or via virtual tours. And now they're finding that this isn't maybe the best place for me. So I think that you take that and the fact that a lot of these coaches didn't get a chance to see guys. I had schools tell me in the Pac-12, we're at 8, 10, 12, 14 players. We're not going to offer any other high schoolers. We're going to either turn our attention towards 23 with the high schoolers and hit the portal really hard for the remaining guys, or we're just going to be affected by the super seniors in the COVID season and worry about the numbers later because the schools are on the hook for those scholarships. No matter how many guys are on scholarship, even if the NCAA allows for a little bit more room, the school still has to pay for them. So a lot of schools are just kind of taking the path of least resistance and just saying, hey, we'll hit the portal. We won't do a lot of high school recruiting, and then we'll wait till our numbers shake out to get back towards that 85 like we're used to.
You mentioned the Pac-12. I think maybe no conference has had a bigger shift in terms of the Power Five than what's happening out west. Obviously, Mario Cristobal leaving Oregon, he was really kind of the guy that was hammering the recruiting trail there. He goes to Miami, and then in comes Lincoln Riley. Is this maybe a bit of a changing of the guard out west, or is this just really USC kind of reasserting their dominance, bringing in a big name like Lincoln Riley?
I think it could potentially be a bit of both. I think we could see USC reestablishing their dominance, but also changing the guard back to Southern California. When you look at what Oregon's class looked like before Mario Cristobal left and where it looks like today, they lost 8 commitments in this class. A number of those players were national guys that maybe were going to be hard to hold on to anyway, but some were local guys. They had 2 in-state prospects, one decommitted, who's an Oregon legacy. The other from Portland decided he was going to wait until February to sign so he could see who the head coach is, see who the position coach was. And then down at USC, you had guys flipping. Now, when the day started, USC had the 105th ranked recruiting class in the country, 12th in the Pac-12. Just 2 commitments started to trend them up. This week could end up adding a few more talented players to the mix. Damani Jackson, the number 2 corner in the country. CJ Williams, a 4-star receiver, both out of Mater Dei High School. And then they could end up closed really well by the time we get to the February signing day. But the immediacy in which they were able to flip Raleek Brown from Oklahoma to USC, flip Malachi Nelson and Makai Lemon from the 2023 class to USC. I think people need to look at that paper, maybe look at those rankings and see where USC is. Take a picture of it, because you're not going to see USC that far down ever again as long as Lincoln Riley's at USC.
I mean, if Lincoln going from OU to USC was kind of the head turner, it seems like Brian Kelly going down to LSU was the jaw dropper of this coaching carousel. What are your expectations from him going into that SEC environment? And then truthfully, how is his replacement, Marcus Freeman, how do you anticipate him doing on the coaching trail? Because the Irish, they were on track to have one of their best classes ever.
Yeah, and in fact, they only lost one commitment in the time being that Brian Kelly he walked away from the head coach before they hired Marcus Freeman. And then they've lost one player since Marcus Freeman's promotion. That's CJ Williams, who was already trending towards decommitting anyway. In fact, Marcus Freeman's hiring actually gave him pause if he was going to decommit, but the Irish are going to still end up with the top 10 class. Now, LSU had a couple players decommit, had a couple guys that said that they're going to wait. Trevonte Citizen, a 4-star running back from in-state, was one of them. Probably the biggest news was Jake Johnson, the brother of Max Johnson, the quarterback at LSU. Jake Johnson decommitted. He committed to Texas A&M late last night. Max Johnson's expected to follow suit and sign with Texas A&M and transfer there as well. So you're going to start to see with LSU, Brian Kelly's been able to have success recruiting-wise, but there's going to be probably a little bit of a feeling out process there, because as we're seeing with Brian Kelly, you're seeing him, with the Southern twang at the basketball game. You're seeing him on the recruiting visits where he's, dancing and flashing for the video. We're seeing Brian Kelly evolve as a person. So perhaps that means Brian Kelly is going to evolve as a recruiter. He's going from a school that obviously has a tradition like Notre Dame does, where there's a lot of academic excellence to it, and maybe couldn't get players in that he thought he would or should be able to. Now he's at LSU, where he's going to have more opportunity to attract players, and he's in one of the most fertile recruiting ground states in the country, and also doesn't have any other Power 5 schools in that state that he's competing against. I think you're going to see LSU's recruiting continue to be solid like it was under Ed Orgeron, and really start to trend upwards in the 2023 class.
In terms of fertile recruiting ground, there's no better place than the state of Florida, and just a fascinating mix of programs right now. Obviously, Mario Cristobal coming in down there in Miami, even having changes at the lower levels with new coaches at FIU and whatnot. What is the kind of the mood around the Sunshine State, especially because there hasn't really been anybody that has taken advantage of essentially the big three being in various states of decline?
Yeah, I think what's probably the most fascinating aspect is that Billy Napier almost essentially came out and said, we're going to punt for the majority of December and focus our efforts on February, but really focus our efforts on 2023. That's how much in the hole Florida was going into signing day. Then they get some elite players to commit to the Gators on signing day, so maybe Billy Napier's strategy changes a little bit. But then you have Mario Cristobal, who there will never be any punting when it comes to recruiting from him. One of the best head coach recruiters in the country, and already at Miami, he was able to land a couple of key guys, Najee Kelly being one of them, almost flipping a couple guys from Oregon that were committed to him. Grayson Halton out of San Diego, who decided he wasn't going to sign with Oregon today. A lot of buzz, he may end up at Miami. So you're going to see Cristobal's recruiting efforts have to basically force Mike Norvell and Billy Napier to raise their game that much more. Billy Napier, obviously coming from Louisiana, recruiting is going to be much different animal at Florida. Mike Norvell has recruited well at Florida State, but I'll tell you what, probably no head coach is in their feelings more today than Mike Norvell losing Travis Hunter, who he had committed for, like I said, almost 2 years. Thought maybe if I'm going to lose him, it's to Georgia. Instead, he takes a second L to an FCS school this year. And so now you got Mario Cristobal coming in, and he's going to ramp up. Those kind of losses of recruits are going to be unacceptable to those fan bases. And I think Mario Cristobal himself is completely going to change the game in recruiting for the big three in Florida.
Now, if there's a changing of the guard there in the Sunshine State, there really hasn't been atop the team rankings. It's the usual suspects. It's Alabama, it's Georgia, it's Ohio State. But I guess maybe the surprise for some people that maybe don't follow the sport or follow recruiting on a daily basis has been the performance of Texas A&M. It seems like Jimbo Fisher certainly has been doing really good work in terms of flipping guys on signing day. How impressive has the Aggies been in terms of this class and certainly going forward?
I mean, they have a generational defensive line class coming in. Walter Nolan, who's the number 2 player in the country behind Travis Hunter, has already been committed. They're able to hold on to him. Gabriel Brownlow-Dindy, they were able to flip him. Anai White from Pennsylvania, one of the top 2 players in the state of Pennsylvania. He announced for them today. Anthony Lucas, the number 1 prospect in the state of Arizona, a 5-star prospect. He announced for A&M today. So you look at Texas A&M, and we've talked about this before, that you see your big recruiting bump after a successful season come in the ensuing class. So with Texas A&M winning the Orange Bowl a year ago, finishing in the top 5, there being a lot of controversy that maybe they should have been invited to the playoffs a year ago. Maybe this season wasn't as exceptional as it was a year ago, but recruiting-wise, they certainly saw the bump from their Orange Bowl season. Jimbo Fisher has long had a tremendous reputation as a recruiter. And you look at A&M's class specifically on the defensive line. We know the defensive line is the most premium position to recruit in all of college football because it's hard to find elite defensive linemen. And Texas A&M pretty much put the monopoly on it this year. And that's why come February, it wouldn't be a surprise with a couple guys here and there if Texas A&M ends up at the top of the charts in the recruiting rankings when it's all said and done, passing Alabama and passing Georgia. Now, can they get it done in the SEC and pass Alabama and pass Georgia and get into the playoffs on their own?
Well, there's certainly no shortage of storylines coming out of the early national signing period. Brandon Huffman, national recruiting editor of 247 Sports. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Brian.